Hey, welcome to Wonderful Works Talks, where we talk all about the disability ministry mission of helping churches become accessible for all. I'm your host, Barb Stanley, and today we're going to talk about a topic that I personally have never heard addressed before, but am so excited to talk about, and that is families impacted by disability and the military. That's right, this is going to be fascinating. But before we get to that, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever stopped to think about how parenting a child with a disability would impact military life? Well, today we're going to talk about that and so much more. Find out what unique strengths and challenges exist for special needs military families, how our guest answers the miracle question, and what challenge we are throwing out to all our listeners today. Oh, and two more quick things before we start. Today you'll notice we have a special co-host, Wonderful Works Special Education Consultant, Leah Wicker. Leah is joining us because she grew up in a military family too, and has some unique perspectives on the topic. And because this conversation was too hard to edit down, because it's just that good, we are going to release this podcast in two parts. Today we'll dive into the military life, and next month we'll go deep and talk about how disability really impacts marriage and how we can all do something to help. So without further ado, please join me as we welcome our guest, retired military chaplain and executive director of the Special Needs Marriage and Family Institute, Brad Lee. So we are so excited today to have Chaplain Brad Lee with us. He is going to be sharing today what it is like being part of a family affected by disability and serving in active military, and some very exciting things that are happening on the horizon that have to do with marriage and supporting special needs families. So Brad, thank you so much for being here today, and we're so excited to have you.
Thank you. It is a joy to be with you, believe me. Very honored.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and why you are so passionate about supporting families affected by disability?
Wow, that could take up the rest of our podcast time, but
Right.
I will just start here. After 25 years, 8 months, 23 days, I retired on the 1st of June this year. So I've been a retiree for not very long, but backing up almost halfway through my career. Well, pretty close to that. In 2013, our son, our fifth child, my wife and I, by the way, Lori, we've been married 33 years. We have 6 children altogether and 1 grandbaby.
Wow.
But Kaydan, who's kind of the focus of our discussion, was born on January 27th, 2013. A wild entrance into the world as he was born in the car on the way to the hospital. We didn't make it. From all the moms listening will appreciate this. From water break to birth was approximately 12 minutes.
Wow.
We didn't get there, but nor did we know that he had Down syndrome. And so in those early moments, even in the car as we're driving to the hospital, my 13-year-old daughter at the time, Shayna, is our middle daughter, she was in the back seat. And I'll never forget, I said, Shayna, grab mom's phone out of her purse and get a picture because nobody's going to believe this. And somewhere in that, I don't remember this, but I think it was my wife who asked Shayna or me or both of us, does he look Downsy to you? And of course, I'm driving 100 miles an hour to get to the hospital and didn't really have time to process that. But in the very early moments, we began to immediately notice, like, okay, he doesn't look like the rest of our kids look. And we frankly knew what we were looking at. And it wasn't though until the next day that we actually had to ask the doctor, okay, when are you going to tell us our son has Down syndrome?
Right.
And that was, and one of the questions that you had originally asked me about how was the medical care in the medical community. And let me just say this, and this isn't a hit on the medical community because we had some great doctors and nurses that cared for us, for Kaydan. But I just don't think that medical professionals in general really are, it's not a matter that they don't want to. I just don't think they're equipped and trained to tell somebody an absolutely life-changing diagnosis about a family member. That was frankly a traumatic moment as I talk about in the work that I do, which I'll get to in a little while. But I'll tell you a hallmark moment that really kind of began to shift my focus and really kind of set the course, the azimuth, if you will, as we say in the Army, for my life's work and my passion about 3 months after Kaydan was born, we had begun occupational therapy, and the wonderful lady Donna came to our home and worked with Kaydan. And she was also the acting president of the Alaska Down Syndrome Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And I was as a chaplain, I got to go to school. I became a marriage and family therapist as well. So I had a clinical background,
Mm-hmm.
and I had just become licensed. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to sound smart and have this conversation with her. And I said, Donna, tell me, what do you notice about the impacts of a special needs child or a child with Down syndrome on the marriages that you see? And I'll never forget, and I wasn't that dramatic, by the way, but I came in my mind, I think that's how I
Yeah.
wanted to sound. But
Yeah.
I'll never forget, she turned to me very matter of factly, almost coldly, and said, "Oh, most of them don't make it." And she turned and went back to her work with Kaydan. And that was a very defining moment for me, realizing that
Mm-hmm.
uh, my wife and we had been a very solid, very high functioning, very active family.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea not only how our world had changed and was going to change, but the fact that we were at risk. And what I
Mm-hmm.
would later find in my doctoral work, and as I continued to do research, is that the divorce rate among those with a special needs child is, and it's really a guess because it's so hard to gauge. There's so many factors, but that divorce rate in the special needs realm of marriages with a special needs child is guesstimated to be somewhere between 70 and 80%.
Mm-hmm.
There are some
Wow.
that say it's not that high, that those numbers are
Mm-hmm.
not really accurate. Show me the evidence. And there's some that argue it's even higher. Again, I say, show me the evidence to that. But I would
Mm-hmm.
say this, and I think accurately, it's higher amongst special needs families than it is among what we would call typical families.
Yeah, well, I can just say, I know there is a lot of debate on that statistic, but put that to the side because if you've ever been part of a family affected by significant disabilities, then it doesn't matter what the number is, it is different and it is hard. And it is
Absolutely.
better when there are more supports because you need them. And this
Yeah.
is why we're so excited to have you on here, Brad, is not just because we will get to the Special Needs Marriage and Family Institute that you are getting ready to start, and we are so excited about. But before that, I know from growing up in a family affected by disability, and my parents were part of that 70-80% that did not make it.
Mm.
Um, how impactful that is on a marriage and family. And that was just being in the civilian world where you should have more stability in that you're in the same place for years, you have a community. And I want to know, what is it like if you are actively in the military? And I know that's a different lifestyle and there's a lot of moving from place to place. I want to understand, what does that feel like? But real quick, before you answer that, for people out there like me who are not very familiar with the military, can you explain what a chaplain does? And then can you tell us about your
Wow.
experience with Kaydan in the military?
Is there a part two to our podcast? Can we do it
It,
like a series to answer those questions? First of all, as a chaplain, obviously, and I was a Nazarene chaplain associated with the Church of the Nazarene, so I maintained that identity. But I wore a uniform. I was an officer like any other officer in that regard. And a very big Army answer. The chaplain's job is to provide and implement religious support, but for people of all faiths. The
Mhm.
justification of the chaplaincy is not based on one church's doctrine or
Okay.
theology, but it's based on the constitutionality of free
Mhm.
exercise. I could talk a lot about that, but that is
Mhm.
kind of in a nutshell what we do. And so, obviously, at the level of pastoral care in the lives of soldiers and families, I did a lot of counseling, which is why I went to become a family life chaplain. I got
Mhm.
selected to go to school to get an additional degree.
Mhm.
Chaplains become specialists in certain areas, and that became my specialty. And obviously, in my work as a chaplain, which was awesome, I had a lot of leeway, and I began to partner with what we call the Exceptional Family Member Program. I
Mhm.
know one of the questions you ask is, how did I do that in the Army? And so I became an advocate in the context of the Army,
Uh,
and partnered with some programs to reach families that had special needs children as well. So that's
mhm.
kind of a nutshell of what a chaplain did and what I kind of uniquely got to do. I also jumped out of planes for 14 years as a chaplain with soldiers. So
Oh,
You do the
Wow.
things that soldiers do too. So it's
Yeah.
not all, it's not a suit and tie kind of ministry. And I'm not dinging on pastors that wear
Yeah.
suits and ties, but it's a very, as we say, boots on the ground, knees in the dirt kind of ministry. I always tell people this. People thought the chaplaincy sounded really cool that were in ministry, and I'm like, if you're not called to it, don't do it, because
Yeah.
it will chew you up and spit you out if you're not called to that.
Yeah. Well, first, let me say thank you for your service in the
Well, thank
military
you.
and as a chaplain. I do think it sounds cool. I'm not gonna lie. Could I do it? No, but I'm
And
so
it
glad that
was
you do it
all
and
good
people
fun.
like you do that. It's so important. So now walk us through what it kind of looks like being a special needs family in the military versus in a civilian life.
Yeah. Well, you hit on a couple of those things already, and that is two big words: community, and the transient nature of the Army lifestyle. As a special needs family, we moved at the end of my career. We figured it up, and we moved on average. I think it was of 2.3. We moved every 2.3 years in my career on average. Now imagine that for people that live in the same place all their lives, they're like, "How do you do that?"
Mhm.
No, we made the best of it. We were in beautiful places like Alaska. We got to be in Hawaii for a little over 2 years. We were at Fort Drum as well at one point. I know, Leah, you spent some time there
Yeah.
as an Army brat.
Yep.
Um, and of course, I got to visit exotic places too, like Afghanistan and other places in deployments and all. I'm being rather facetious about that, but anyway, but the transient nature of Army life, and the really big thing, most of us do not get stationed near family. That's when you ask that question, from the special needs family element perspective, I think back to when I called my parents. So Kaydan was born on a Sunday night, and it wasn't until a couple days later that I called my family and even my mother-in-law and stepfather-in-law to tell. My wife couldn't do it or didn't want to do it, and so she had me call. And I remember I was driving home from the hospital and called my parents to tell them that Kaydan, yes, he'd been born in the car. It was exciting, all of that. He's okay, but he had Down syndrome. And that was a very intense moment sharing that with family. And we were in Alaska at the time, and they were 3,500 miles away. There was no, hey, we'll be to the hospital, in a couple hours, or give us 30 minutes or whatever. I became involved later on. We would move to North Carolina, where we had some great support there, and really kind of began to develop a sense of community. But I became involved with the North Carolina Down Syndrome Alliance. And what I found with the other families on the board that I served with is most of them who had a child with Down syndrome had grown up there. They lived there. Their family lived there. And they had all these wonderful supports. And I remember just feeling this twinge of jealousy, like, that's not my experience.
Right.
And so the sense, the flip side of that is you develop some really incredible relationships with other people. But again, the transient nature of it is you become friends with your neighbors across the street or down, or on post, but they move, and then and you move. And so it's always this kind of Velcro sense of the people that come in and out of your life are put there, and then they're just ripped out. And so that I think takes a toll and really impacts, because to be really honest and frank, which I think is what you would want, my wife found it easy as life got harder for us with Kaydan, which wasn't until he was about 2 or 3. Those first 2 years were the easiest, frankly.
Right. Right.
As he got a little older, it became very easy for her and us, really, as a family, to kind of pull back. In fact, I would just dare say, if it weren't for the fact that I was a chaplain and part of a chapel community, that going to church was just really hard. I mean, I served in a chapel in Hawaii, and I'll never forget the shock on their faces when I said this, but this drives home the point of how challenging it could be. I said to my team that I was a part of, fellow chaplains, I said, guys, I love you. I love worshiping with you. But as a special needs parent, you just need to hear this. If it weren't for the fact that I was part of the team, I wouldn't come to church here. I would not come to this chapel, because we have no way, understanding, or means to support families like ours.
Right.
And so there was that dynamic, even from a spiritual perspective of faith. Our military chapels, frankly, do not have the bandwidth even they barely have the bandwidth to have the conversation, let alone to do anything about it. So doing the work that you ladies do and that I'm doing in the special needs ministry realm, and thank God there are churches coming online, waking up to that reality and engaging in that. But that was hard as well. How the church responds, and how the military chapel community responded to us. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my answer, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah.
Now, but
I think what I'm hearing you say is it was harder because you felt a little bit isolated from the supports that other people had. So your
Yeah.
family wasn't around because you're being stationed different places. The supports were not naturally set up within the military, if I'm hearing this right, like even in the church military community for families with special needs. And so that would make it harder. And on top of that, and this is why I'm so fascinated by this topic and want to hear how, as a community, we can all help. I know because my brother has autism, how incredibly difficult it is to change routine and to form new relationships. And so the thought of like having to move him every 2 years, I can't imagine the amount of extra stress that would add into a family dealing with that. Was that really hard? Was that hard for Kaydan as he got older?
Yeah, having this conversation as I was talking to her about what I was doing today, the first word out of her mouth was transitions.
Yeah.
Just from, for you mentioned autism, and this Kaydan later was diagnosed with autism. Transitions are a big deal.
Right.
The whole idea of, hey, Jimmy, go get in the car, we're leaving, is that doesn't work with kids like Kaydan.
No.
It takes backward planning and time and all that. And
Yeah.
I tell people all the time, what's it like being a special needs parent in the world, fast-paced world that we live in? And I said, I feel like I'm driving a tractor on the freeway.
Yeah.
That's kind of what life feels like a lot of times.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think one of the observations that I've had, and to really give you a sense of what it's like in the military. Now, on one hand, the military has some great supports. I mean, we had in Hawaii, we had access to a really great developmental pediatrician. There's just by law, the military does a great job of saying, you have this need, you're serving your country, we're going to provide this. And if we can't provide it on post or at a military hospital, we're going to refer you off post. So we had a number of referrals for Kaydan, but that in and of itself is taxing. I remember one of the statistical data points in the special needs world is that for special needs families, an average, it sounds really high, but I'll explain this. The number of appointments and hours spent in pursuing medical behavioral treatment is a ratio of 50 to 1 compared to typical children. I first saw that and I'm like, how can that be? But when you factored in that Kaydan got 20 hours of ABA therapy a week and endocrinology and speech therapy and occupational therapy, it's like 50 to 1 sounds kind of low in some cases. So you think of the impact of time. But here's what I noticed in the military context too, and which is really sad, and this has a great segue into the church, especially those near military communities. There are obviously Kaydan, you kind of can't hide his diagnosis, but let's take a child with autism. I mean, that normally doesn't show up until a little later.
Right.
I worked with military families who the mom knew their son had autism, but the dad was like, you know what? The kid just needs to listen more.
Yeah.
And we can't get a diagnosis because once we're in the exceptional family member program, I'm not going to have access to certain assignments. And so, because when you're in the EFMP, exceptional family member program, that's how they track how to help take care of you. And this is an unfortunate and harsh reality for some.
That.
Yes. And
Yeah, I didn't either.
And here's the underside and the real underbelly of that. There are people that hide those diagnoses that are real so that it doesn't, because for service members, there's a lot of service members across other branches too. Every branch has some version of EFMP. Unfortunately, a lot of families don't understand it. And to be really honest too, it is bureaucracy, and it can be
Yeah.
very hard to navigate and very challenging. And once
Mhm.
you're in the system, right, you have this kind of label. You have an
Mhm.
EFMP child.
Oh my
And
gosh,
so
that's
people
tough.
people would think that they were going to be not allowed to go to a certain assignment, especially those, if I'm going to get promoted, I got to do this job. And for mobility, and that's a whole other conversation about our identity and how soldiers, all service members, can easily get wrapped up into the identity of wearing a uniform and forget that
Mhm.
they're a dad and a
Yeah.
husband. And who are we when we take the uniform off? And I would argue that as believers, when our identity is rooted in Christ, it doesn't matter if I wear a uniform or a suit and tie. I
Mhm.
had a good friend, Terry Wardle, who used to say, never tie your identity to something you can lose. And I
Amen.
think that's so true,
Yeah.
especially for the military, because we can wear the uniform and a rank and all the badges and things, and it looks really cool, right?
Mhm.
But for families, for there's special needs families in the context of the military community, navigating that EFMP system can become very isolating. And so a
Yeah.
lot of families avoid it. And really, they suffer in silence. And
Wow.
so they walk into your church door, and you see, and especially you ladies who work in this realm, you see
Mhm.
a kid and you're like, that, I know that kid has autism. I know we're not labeling people, we're not doctors,
Right, right.
but it's like, you know what
Yeah,
you're looking at.
that's exactly right.
And you go up to the family and say, tell me about your child. And you're waiting on them to tell you they have a diagnosis, and there's no diagnosis. And so
Yeah,
therefore there's no care. And so that's the other side in the
yeah,
military context of, unfortunately, I've heard so
yeah,
many times happen.
yeah. I want to unpack that for just a minute because I didn't know anything about that. This is fascinating, but also it's kind of hurts my heart a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, so the EMFP, tell me again, what does that stand for?
EFMP,
Okay, say it again.
exceptional EFMP,
Okay.
exceptional family member program.
Exceptional Family Member Program.
Correct.
So I know, I don't know a lot about the military, but I know that was made for the benefit of families, and the heart
Absolutely.
behind it is 100% great. And
Hmm.
again, sure, there are a lot of parts of it that are really good to supports for families. So
Yes.
we want to hear all of that. On the flip side, what I'm hearing happening is when you have a child who has a hidden disability, like what you're
Hmm.
saying, it can be
Hmm.
hard to get a diagnosis. And especially like I sometimes call some kids are what I call living on the borderland, which
Mm.
is kind of right on that edge between
Yep.
having a diagnosis and not. And what happens a lot of times is that when your child does have that hidden disability, there's a lot of judgment from others in that you
Hmm.
don't have the diagnosis or they don't look like they should have a diagnosis. And so then they think the child is bad or the parents are bad. And it's a lot of shame. And so, in a lot of families, that's hard to deal with enough as it is. And
Yeah.
what you also said with the dads being late adopters of my child actually has a diagnosis, needs a diagnosis, that is also common in the civilian world. But what I'm hearing you say is on top of that, these families are having to wrestle with is getting this diagnosis and having that community and getting that support worth maybe not doing what I thought I was going to do in my career? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's yeah, and it sounds really ugly, but it's like ultimately I have the choice to make a decision that I'm going to disavow the
Mhm.
potential for a diagnosis that might otherwise derail what I want to do in my career.
Mhm.
That's very generic,
Mhm.
and not always true, and maybe
Right.
not that may be a little simplistic,
Mhm.
but for some people, it is a literal choice denying, if you will,
Mhm.
to use a much stronger word, that we're
Mhm.
not going to pursue a diagnosis. Billy just needs to listen more, and he needs more discipline. I mean, like
Mhm.
what's the military based on? Discipline, right?
Right.
So what am I going to do with my kid? Well, if he's not
Right.
listening, we'll just discipline him more, and he'll get over this, and he'll grow out of it. I mean,
Right.
that's one of the false narratives about autism as well. They'll just outgrow it, get over it, and you know what? When and I've seen this too. Some guy, well, I say guys, but unfortunately, military tends to be a lot of male driven.
Mhm.
A lot of women in the military too, and very successful and in great positions of leadership as well. But what I see is from men, they would tell their wife, "Hey, let me. If I get this job, I'm going to get promoted. And
Right.
after that, then we'll look at Billy and getting a diagnosis. And so the
Right.
can just gets kicked down the road
Right.
because, and I'm not trying to ding on the military, but I'm
Right.
tired
Right.
now, but there's a dangling of the carrot with the next best thing on the horizon a
Right.
lot of times to keep people engaged and pursuing and basically use your talents for the for the benefit of the Army. I mean, the military has a mission to do, right? And we're going to
Right.
exploit talent and use it to its fullest extent, and that's one of the ways that that happens.
Right. Well, the
And
reason I want to stop on here real quick is because for people who are listening, when you are in a family affected by disability, there are so many hidden layers of stress and complexity that if you're not part of that family, you don't even know exist.
yeah,
And so it's really important we start having these conversations about what people are really dealing with because I'm just thinking about it from a civilian's point of view. I've always been very grateful for people in the military, especially since I feel like I don't have the right stuff to do it because it's hard. This is a hard job. It takes your whole heart and soul, and sometimes you can get in a lot of trauma. And then on top of that, if you're dealing with trying to be a good parent in a system that's not set up for disability, that's a lot of emotional turmoil on parents. And I want people hearing this to say, this is why we're having this conversation today. Not that we're going to solve it, but that we can
that's
be
right.
aware that we need to be praying for people. We need to be asking, what can we do to support our military families affected by disability and some of that. So, um, thank you so much for talking about this today. Leah, what are
Absolutely.
your thoughts on this?
Well, extremely surprised to hear you say about how they group kind of families together with that have children with disabilities and that
Mhm.
they can only go to certain stations, which is really interesting. I was just curious, just in general, how are the military hospitals with like providing the care for kids with disabilities, like the speech pathologists or physical therapists, things like that? Do all of the military installations tend to have those, or is it just specific ones?
Well, let me be very clear about, as you call it, the lumping in and the grouping of
Yeah,
families, because the intent behind that, and Barb, you might have mentioned this, is
Mhm.
very there's a purity in the intent
sure.
Absolutely.
because every hospital in the Army or military has different capabilities, and so the design of the Exceptional Family Member Program (EFMP)
Mhm.
Mhm.
is designed so that if we know, for example, I mean with Kaydan has Down syndrome, he has
Mhm.
autism. So they're not going to send the intent of the EFMP program is so that we send you to a place where we know that we can care for you properly.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that is the bottom line in its purest form intent.
Right.
Now the
Mhm.
reality is what part of what happens, unfortunately, is so for
Yeah.
example, it might surprise some people to find out that Hawaii is considered, first of all, overseas, but when we were there, it was also considered incredibly EFMP friendly because
Mhm.
there's just a lot of medical resources there.
Mhm.
On the island of Oahu, there's a
Oh, yeah.
million people, right? So
Yeah.
there are a lot of people who are practice medicine there. So
Mhm.
um, so there were a lot of resources in
Mhm.
Hawaii, so that it was a popular place to send EFMP families to.
Mhm.
Um, but if I'm wanting to go to Fort whatever somewhere
Right.
else
Right,
Right.
right.
because of a job there or because of a certain type of unit or whatever, but they don't
Mhm.
really
Mhm.
have, I don't think they have. And there's just, frankly, even in the military,
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
be fair, there's just a lot of ignorance about what EFMP does and what they can offer, how they really do try to help. And
Mhm.
I'll speak on their behalf because a
Mhm.
lot of times they have to work through their own bureaucracy and
Sure.
their own red tape to care for
Sure.
families. Sometimes just because of the way a law is written, their
Sure.
hands get tied, and that's very
Yeah.
Mhm.
frustrating to see. So
Yeah.
that's kind of the other side of that. That its
Yeah.
intent is to really help care for families. Unfortunately, if you don't enroll in the program or you somehow are able to escape through it,
Mhm.
the Army doesn't know, and then you show up at Fort X and
Right.
oh, hey, I think then the wife goes in with the son, and a doctor says, hey, I think your son has X, Y, and Z, but we don't have the capability to care for that.
Right.
And you hear those stories, but sometimes that backstory is also running in as part of the script too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, I am very grateful to hear that the military is doing something to support families. And from what I'm hearing you say, they're trying to hook families up with the best resources and
Absolutely.
medical resources.
Yep.
And so we 100% support that.
Yes, that is amazing that they're
Yeah.
able to make an effort to do that for families. I just didn't realize that it wasn't just offered at every military
Yeah.
installation, but it makes sense that, I mean, I know some of them are pretty remote, so getting people
Yes.
to those would be difficult. So that does make
Absolutely.
sense.
With that, Brad, with so many people in certain areas that are in this what I'm gonna say wrong.
EFMP.
So was there a support system there for the families? Because there should be other families affected by disability kind of all in that area. Did you see that?
I did, and I think that's why I really tried to partner with EFMP
Yeah.
because, again, I think their hands were often tied, and the reaching into the community. Uh, Frankly, it was a great effort, but it had a very small return on the effort.
Mhm.
I would be invited to speak on the special needs marriage, and there would literally just be a handful, and unfortunately, it tended to be the spouses or often wives, because they would do it at 10 in the morning. Well, where's the service member? They're at work.
Right.
Mhm.
So it was very hard to capture those families, and so that's why I said let's do an event at
Mhm.
a time when these families can actually come bring their kids and let us kind of function together as community. But that's a really hard that's an uphill climb to do in the context of the military, and
Mhm.
it's not done often. I
Mhm.
will tell you this as an aside. I was in Joint Special Operations Command when I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I partnered with an organization called Victory Junction, and you may have heard of it. It is a wonderful organization and place, and I did, at least to my knowledge, one of the first ever family retreats solely focused on special needs families.
Mhm.
And this again was the learning. The reason I'm sharing this, so they had partnered with a college, and the college brought in nursing students, education students, who basically served as buddies for each kid. Each kid
Mhm.
ended up having about 4 different college students hanging around with them
Uh-huh.
during the entire weekend. But we had a session in one of the afternoons in which I brought all the parents into one room. There were about 17 families or so, and it just struck me as such a it was both sad and it is exhilarating at the same time. I had a
Right.
couple who had an 18-year-old daughter with cerebral palsy,
Mhm.
and they sat in this room with all these other special needs parents of varying degrees of diagnoses and said, "We have never talked about this with anybody else."
Mhm.
And that just, in one sense, it infuriated me. On the other hand, it just spurred me to continue this work because it's like,
Right.
there are people that really do suffer in silence,
Yeah.
navigating not only their career, military life, the challenges of that, but being a special needs parent and just trying to survive.
Right.
Um,
I'm just curious with the churches in those military installations that have the larger grouping of kids with disabilities, are there any supports for them in the church setting that would be maybe a little different than the others churches?
you talking about military chapels? Or
Yeah.
you talking?
Yeah, military chapels, yeah, because I know often when they're in a
Yeah.
remote area, they're kind of what's available for families. So I didn't know if there was any like disability supports for families within the church setting.
Not specifically.
Okay.
I mean, I found as a chaplain, obviously I was, a leader in that community, and people
Yeah.
knew who Kaydan was and were very accepting and kind to us. But as far as really kind of getting us and supporting us in that sense, no. It was interesting. I actually wrote an article for the Chaplain Corps journal, and I think I called it Mosaic Ministry, and it was really an academic effort. That was the kind of the professional journal of our the chaplaincy, and I wrote what I thought was a pretty good article about just having the conversation about what would a special needs ministry look like in the chapel. And
Yeah.
the most that I got were a few accolades of, "Hey, Brad, great article."
Mhm.
But to my knowledge, that never took root anywhere. Uh, I mean, and as you ladies know, there's just a lot involved in that. But
Yeah.
Mhm.
but there was no real passion, no real recognition, I think, of the deep need in that
Mhm.
community. And I think most families that had special needs children unless they were chaplains, frankly, found somewhere off post or just didn't go to church.
I'm curious, to take your wording there, Leah, but I'm curious, with the chapels, what can the disability ministry community and this movement that we're all a part of, what can we be doing to help support those chapels better?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because here's the problem from the outside now looking into a military community. There's a fence and a gate.
Yeah.
And unless you have an ID card, you can't get on the other side of that gate. I remember as a chaplain, when I was on active duty, there were churches that wanted to partner with the local, chapel community or the military community. And the chaplaincy, very frankly, one of the, kind of things we don't talk about, we're not very friendly toward outside entities outside of the gate that want to come in and help us.
Sure. Right.
But I think that may have changed a little in recent years. There's obviously some mega churches that have planted themselves next to military communities that have done very well. And here's the reality. In the chapel, to explain a little bit more even about what I did, chaplains, you're a unit chaplain. You're taking care of soldiers, airmen, sailors, whatever. Pastoring a chapel community is really kind of an extra duty, frankly. There's just not a lot of time that they have to give to it. Now, the flip side is that can lead some opportunity. And there are certain, I know when I've been at different posts, for example, when I was in Alaska, there were some great connections between the chapel community and the off-post community from a ministerial standpoint. And we actually did collaborative work because there were a lot of churches that had military members. And so as a family life chaplain, I got to go and speak about combat trauma and those kind of things. And so there are those conversations that can happen, but they can be very unique to the personality of the chaplain and their passion, and as well as the community's desire and what level of interest there is to engage. But frankly, if you're a church, I would say this: if you're within an hour of a military base and you're very specifically catering to ministering to special needs families, and you advertise that, they're going to find you. Because the military chapel community and this isn't a hit on them because I was a chaplain. I loved what I did. I loved the Corps in that sense, but we just didn't have the bandwidth to pull that off.
Sure.
Every now and then somebody would do it for a while, but again, we didn't do it systemically and as part of like the program, if you will. It was very much like me who came in. But unfortunately, I came in at a couple junctures in chapels that I was involved in. For example, during COVID, I probably would have had the traction to start a special needs ministry there, but COVID really kind of ruined a lot of things. But here I am on the side of retirement now doing other work. So
yeah, that's right.
Stop there. But
yeah. Real quick, Brad, on that part with the chaplaincy and the special needs ministry, if you could wake up tomorrow and one thing was different in the military, specifically to disability ministry support in the military chapels, because you and I both know you grow up in a family with special needs, your faith is a difference maker. It's a difference maker in everyone's life, if you have faith or not. But when you are in an everyday struggle that's different than most people around you, that faith component is even more important, in my opinion. So being able to give access to people in the military to this easier, if you could wake up and one thing was different and it was a little bit easier, what would that difference look like?
That's a great question. The miracle question, as it were.
Yes, it is.
No, I think that there would simply be a welcoming spirit and a sensitivity that, you really do have a different journey, and coming to church is different for you. And again, I'll kind of answer this. And again, I kind of hate saying this, and they just didn't know what to do. And how to deal with it. And again, they're so busy, and chaplains are stretched and really given an impossible mission set to accomplish. And this is just one more thing. If you asked me if I could wake up and that were a reality, that would be it. Because there were days that we would go to chapel. We didn't in fairness during COVID, and even as we came out of COVID, like doing the nursery was not an option, right? And so even as a chapel community, we had to figure out, well, what do we do with the kids? Well, we made a little area in the back of the church chapel there to kind of let them play, had some toys, and parents just kind of self-governed. But that didn't work for Kaydan, because Kaydan doesn't sit down and play like a typical child. Now, he may for 5 minutes, but there were Sundays, he went and he climbed in the baptistry during church, and it's like, and my wife was incredibly embarrassed, and I get it. But there were Sundays that my wife would say, I'm going home. And we were 20 minutes into the service. She would say, I'm taking him and I'm going home. It's too hard. It's too embarrassing. And unfortunately for me, and this, again, this isn't maybe reality, but even it's how I felt, was nobody understood that. Nobody got that.
Right. Yes.
It's like, oh, where'd your wife go? Well, she left. And it's like, I don't think you really understand why and how hard that is for her at an emotional level of having a child that does the things that he does. I mean, we were in a phase where he would just take all of his clothes off on the playground.
Yeah.
That's a whole other problem.
Right.
And so there were times that she just left and came home with him, and nobody got that. And I think if I could change anything, if there was an answer to that question of the dream, be that we kind of woke up to that and got it. And I think that's true for the church. These people that are chaplains were people too. They're clergymen ordained just like a pastor of a local church, unique mission set, but they're people too. And if God could change their hearts and go, hey, we need to love these people and support them in a little different way than we do everybody else, that'd be the dream come true.
Well, I just want to say two things. One is, please hear us say, we believe in the heart of the military and the heart of the what is it? What is it? That one. We believe in the heart behind it. We believe in the heart behind it. And from what I'm hearing you say in this conversation, what the military is dealing with is exactly the same thing the Big C church has been dealing with, where we believe that they want to serve families well, but they don't really know how to do it yet.
Right.
And so please know that we are grateful for everything that the military is doing as they're trying to figure it out. So I want to make that clear. The second thing I want to say is I would just like to challenge people listening today. This is a big issue that still has a long way to go. And if you are a praying person, would you please pray for conversations to get started in the military, so that the military people making the decisions and the systems are learning more from the families like yours, Brad, about what it's really like and all these different aspects, including churches. And also to the churches, especially those that are around military bases, to start having conversations with military families about what is it like to be part of a military family. Because I feel like to make your miracle dream a reality, that's where we need to start. We need to start asking more questions and doing more listening. So if you're a praying person, will you please add that to your prayers, that we can take steps forward to help support our military families who have children with exceptional needs.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Well, this is important. I think it is important. I mean, no one would be worse in the military than me. I can't get up in the morning. I'm messy. Like, it would be a disaster. But I am so grateful for people who do it, because, I mean, we owe you everything. We owe you our freedom, and we need to support you. I just think this is just a super important topic, and we need to be talking about it more and more and more. Leah, do you have any other questions about the military life?
I don't think so, not off the top of my head anyway. It's just been really enlightening to me just to kind of hear your experiences with church and everything. I grew up going to the chapels on the bases, the military bases, so I kind of have that experience, and it seems like things are still very similar to the way they were when I was a kid. So I agree with what Barb's saying. We do need to start having those conversations, and it sounds like they're doing a lot of positive things, but of course there's always more that can be done.
Hey listeners, so I told you we had way too much good stuff to discuss for just one episode, so that's where we're going to stop for today. But I do hope you'll take some time and really think about how we can best support our military families, and make it a point to participate in the prayer challenge to pray for more conversations to get started about this very important topic. If you'd like to hear more from Brad, then please visit his website at walkingwithkaydan.com, and that's Kaydan spelled Kaydan. Then come back next month for part 2 of our interview with Chaplain Brad Lee. In the meantime, don't forget, if you like this podcast, please follow and share with others. See you next time.